I warned my business partner if he made one more decision without me, I'd dissolve our company, and he signed a contract behind my back. The conference room smelled like overpriced coffee and the kind of tension that makes your jaw ache. David sat across from me, his fingers drumming that same irritating pattern on the mahogany table we'd picked out together 6 years ago when we signed the lease on this building. Back then, we'd laughed about how pretentious the wood grain looked, how we were two kids from nothing pretending to be serious businessmen. Now the table felt like a barrier between us, and I couldn't remember the last time either of us had laughed about anything. His eyes wouldn't meet mine, and that told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. We'd built Harrison Analytics from a shared apartment and maxed out credit cards into a $15 million operation with 43 employees who depended on us to make smart decisions together, the way we'd always promised each other we would. Quote, "Saxern mai," David said, and those 7 words made my stomach drop because courtesy meant he'd already done something irreversible. I signed the Meridian contract yesterday. They needed an answer by close of business, and you were unreachable. His tone carried that defensive edge he got when he knew he was wrong, but had already committed to his course of action. I'd been unreachable because I was at my daughter's school play, the one I'd marked on our shared calendar 3 weeks in advance, the one he'd acknowledged with a thumbs-up emoji in our group chat. Maya had been a tree in the background, barely visible, but she'd practiced her one line about seasons changing for 2 weeks straight, and I'd promised her I'd be there. David knew this. Everyone in the office knew this because I'd mentioned it in our Monday morning meeting when we'd discussed the Meridian timeline and agreed we'd make the decision together after reviewing their revised terms. I felt my hands curl into fists under the table, nails digging into palms. We agreed to review their terms together. That was the entire point of asking for the extension. They gave us until Friday, David. Today is Wednesday. The Meridian deal would integrate their proprietary software with our analytics platform, effectively making us dependent on their infrastructure for 60% of our client deliverables. It was the kind of decision that could define the company's trajectory for the next decade, and he'd made it alone in some conference room while I was watching my 8-year-old daughter whisper about autumn leaves. David finally looked at me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not guilt, not even defiance, but a kind of cold calculation that made him look like a stranger wearing my best friend's face. Their terms were good, Kevin. Better than good. They're giving us preferential rates for the first 18 months and guaranteed priority support. I ran the numbers, and this puts us ahead of schedule for the Q4 projections by at least 20%. He slid a folder across the table, and I didn't touch it because touching it would mean accepting what he'd done, would mean participating in this revisionist history where his unilateral decision was somehow justified by spreadsheets and projections. I'd met David 12 years ago in a data science certification program neither of us could really afford, both of us working full-time jobs and attending night classes, both of us dreaming bigger than our circumstances suggested we had any right to. We'd bonded over terrible vending machine coffee and a shared conviction that we could build something that mattered, something that would give opportunities to people like us who hadn't gone to prestigious schools or had family connections. Quote 4, I said, keeping my voice level even though everything in me wanted to shout. Quote Bether 5. I watched his jaw tighten, watched him prepare his justifications, and I realized I was tired of this pattern, tired of having the same argument in different variations, tired of being treated like a junior partner in the company I'd sacrificed everything to build. David leaned back in his chair with that negotiation posture he used with difficult clients. You're being dramatic. These were time-sensitive opportunities that required quick action. We can't operate like some democratic committee where every decision needs a full debate. We'd miss every opportunity while we're sitting around discussing feelings. The condescension in his tone made something crack inside me, some fundamental assumption about our partnership that I'd been holding on to despite mounting evidence to the contrary. This wasn't about efficiency or business strategy. This was about control, about David deciding somewhere along the way that his judgment was more valuable than our partnership, that the company we'd built together was really his company that I was lucky to be part of. Quote 7. I said quietly, and the shift in my tone made him stop his finger drumming. Quote The dissolution clause was something our lawyer had insisted on including in our partnership agreement, a nuclear option neither of us thought we'd ever use. It gave either partner the right to force a company dissolution and asset split if they could demonstrate that the partnership was no longer functioning as intended. David's expression shifted from irritation to alarm, and I saw him realize that I wasn't bluffing. "You can't be serious," he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "You'd destroy everything we built because you're upset about a contract decision? The Meridian deal is good for us, Kevin. It's good for the employees, good for our clients, good for our growth trajectory. You're letting ego get in the way of logic." He was trying to reframe this, trying to make me the unreasonable one, the emotional one, who couldn't see the bigger picture. It was a tactic he'd used before, and I'd let it work, because some part of me had always believed that David's confidence meant he knew something I didn't. But I'd spent the past 2 months documenting every unilateral decision, every dismissal of my input, every time he'd positioned himself as the real leader and me as the cautious sidekick holding us back. I stood up, and the scrape of my chair against the floor felt like punctuation. Quote 11. David's face went pale, and I saw him doing the mental math, realizing what dissolution actually meant in practical terms. It meant Harrison Analytics would cease to exist as an entity. It meant we'd have to notify all our clients that the company was dissolving. It meant 43 people would be job hunting. Most importantly, it meant David would lose the control he'd been consolidating. "You're making a mistake," David said, uncertainty replacing his earlier confidence. "Let's take a few days to cool off. We can bring in a mediator, work through this like adults. This is fixable, Kevin." I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of him lecturing me about impulsive decisions after what he'd just done. Instead, I picked up my phone and notebook from the table. Quote 14. I told him, and that was mostly true. I felt something clearer and colder than anger, something that had been crystallizing over months of small dismissals and broken promises. Quote 15. I walked out of the conference room and past the cubicles where our employees were working, most of them oblivious to the fact that their jobs had just become uncertain. And I felt the weight of that responsibility, alongside the certainty that I couldn't keep enabling David's behavior just to maintain stability. The next 72 hours moved with the grinding inevitability of a natural disaster. I filed the dissolution papers with our attorney on Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, David had called an emergency all-hands meeting without telling me. I found out about it from Jessica in accounting, who texted me asking if the rumors about the company closing were true. I arrived at the meeting 15 minutes late to find David at the front of our main conference room, 43 faces turned toward him with confusion and concern. He saw me enter, and his practiced speech faltered before he recovered. Quote 16, he was saying, his voice smooth and reasonable. Quote 17. It was a masterful performance of misdirection and half-truths, and I watched several people visibly relax. I waited until he'd opened the floor for questions, and several people had asked softball questions he'd answered with vague optimism. Then I raised my hand like I was just another employee, and I saw panic flash across David's face. "Kevin, do you want to add anything?" he asked, trying to sound collaborative. I walked to the front of the room and turned to face our employees, people I'd hired personally, people whose kids' names I knew, and I decided they deserved the truth. "David's right that we're having partnership disagreements," I said steadily. "What he didn't mention is that I've filed for dissolution of Harrison Analytics. The company will cease operations within 90 days, and all of you will need to start looking for new positions." The room erupted in shocked exclamations and overlapping questions. Jessica stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Why are you dissolving the company? Can't you two just work this out?" Her questions were reasonable, and she deserved reasonable answers. David has made several major business decisions without my consultation or consent, despite our partnership agreement requiring joint approval for significant matters. Most recently, he signed a contract with Meridian Technologies yesterday that ties our entire infrastructure to their platform without my knowledge. I warned him last month that one more unilateral decision would result in dissolution, and he chose to ignore that warning. David jumped in before I could continue, his face flushed with anger. "You're punishing 43 people because your ego got bruised." I looked directly at David and kept my voice calm. I'm protecting my professional integrity and honoring our partnership agreement. You've been treating our joint company as your personal project for months, and I've documented every instance where you violated our agreement. I turned back to the employees and made a decision I'd been considering since filing the papers. Quote 25. The room went silent as people processed this new dimension, realizing they weren't just losing jobs, but potentially choosing between two competing futures. David's face had gone from flushed to pale. I pulled out my phone to reference the partnership agreement. I left the meeting before he could respond, and I spent the rest of the day fielding calls and messages from employees who wanted to know more about my new venture. By Friday evening, 18 people had committed to joining me, including Jessica and most of our senior analysts. I called my lawyer Saturday morning to discuss next steps, and she told me something that made the entire landscape shift. Quote 28, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Quote 29. I felt my jaw clench. Quote 30. My lawyer was quiet for a moment. Quote 31. The accusation hit me like cold water because it was technically true and completely misleading. Raymond had been my college roommate long before he became Tech Dynamics' VP of Operations, and we'd had lunch together every few months for the past decade. 2 weeks ago, he'd asked how things were going, and I'd been honest about the partnership tensions and mentioned I was considering my options, including potentially starting over on my own. It was a conversation between old friends, the kind of venting session that happens over mediocre sushi and shared history. But David's attorney was going to frame it as premeditation, as evidence that I'd been planning to poach clients long before filing for dissolution, that my partnership concerns were manufactured to justify a theft I'd been plotting for months. That was a personal lunch with a friend, I told my lawyer, but I could hear the defensiveness in my own voice. Raymond and I have been getting lunch every few months since college. The fact that his company is one of our clients doesn't make every conversation we have about business a solicitation. My lawyer made a non-committal sound. The problem is the timing and the appearance. If David can establish that you were planning this dissolution as a pretext to steal the company's most valuable assets, then he has a legitimate argument that you're acting in bad faith. That could void the dissolution clause or at least trigger months of litigation. I sat down hard on my couch, feeling the weight of complexity I'd been trying to avoid. David wasn't just contesting the dissolution. He was reframing my entire narrative, turning my response to his betrayals into a calculated theft. What are my options? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer would involve more lawyers, more time, and more money than I'd planned. She paused. I closed my eyes and tried to think strategically rather than just reacting emotionally. A settlement would mean compromise, would mean giving David something he didn't deserve just to avoid the pain and expense of fighting him in court. But it would also mean freedom to move forward, to start building something new without the shadow of litigation. I thought about the 18 people who'd committed to following me, people who'd been loyal enough to bet their careers on my new venture, and I realized I owed them certainty more than I owed myself, the satisfaction of fighting David to the bitter end. Set up a negotiation meeting, I told my lawyer, but I want everything in writing, and I want it clear that any settlement is without admission of wrongdoing on my part. The settlement negotiation happened in a neutral law office downtown, the kind of place with expensive abstract art and furniture designed to intimidate. David brought 2 attorneys, which told me he was taking this seriously. I brought my lawyer and a folder of documentation, including every text message, email, and witness statement, showing David's pattern of unilateral decisions. We sat across from each other in a conference room that probably cost more per hour than most people made in a day, and I studied the stranger who used to be my closest friend. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes, but his jaw was set with stubborn determination. His lead attorney, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit, started with the standard opening about finding a reasonable resolution. Quote 40, she said, sliding a document across the table. Quote 41. I scanned the document, and I felt my anger building with each clause designed to handicap my new firm while giving David everything that mattered. Quote 42. I said before my lawyer could stop me. Quote 43. David leaned forward, his expression holding something between satisfaction and regret. I felt my hands curl into fists under the table. David's attorney exchanged a glance with him, and I saw some silent communication pass between them. Then she pulled out another folder, and my lawyer's posture shifted in a way that made my stomach drop. David's attorney said, her tone shifting to something sharper. She slid several pages across the table, screenshots of text messages, emails, and what looked like financial records. These show that Mr. Brennan has been planning to start a competing firm for at least 4 months, that he discussed specific client targeting strategies with potential investors, and that he began setting up corporate structures for a new entity 6 weeks before filing for dissolution. This wasn't a response to partnership problems. This was a planned corporate raid disguised as a partnership dispute. I stared at the documents, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing, and then I realized with sickening clarity what David had done. The financial records showed corporate filings for Brennan Analytics LLC, dated 6 weeks ago. The text messages showed conversations I'd apparently had with someone named Andrew Chen, discussing client strategies and employee recruitment. The emails detailed a timeline for launching a competing firm that aligned perfectly with when I'd filed for dissolution. Every single document was fabricated, a sophisticated forgery designed to support David's narrative. I looked up at David, and I saw him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite parse. "This is fake," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "All of this is fabricated. I never had those conversations. I never filed for a new corporate entity. I never planned any of this." David's attorney didn't even blink. "These are authenticated records, Mr. Brennan. The corporate filing is public record. The messages were recovered from your phone through legal discovery protocols. We have an expert witness prepared to testify to their authenticity. If you're claiming they're fabricated, you're the one who's going to need to prove it, and that's going to be expensive and time-consuming." My lawyer put a hand on my arm, a gentle pressure that meant, wait, think, don't react yet. She leaned in to whisper, quote, 52. I felt trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. David had manufactured evidence to support his narrative, had somehow created a paper trail that made me look like exactly what he was accusing me of being. Quote, 53. I said, forcing my voice to stay level. Quote, 54. David's attorney smiled without warmth. We'd be happy to provide that information through formal discovery once you decide whether you want to proceed with litigation or accept a reasonable settlement. But I'll tell you right now that fighting this in court means months of your life and hundreds of thousands of dollars defending against fraud charges while your reputation gets destroyed. The settlement we're offering gives you a clean exit and the ability to move forward. You just have to accept some reasonable restrictions. David spoke for the first time since his attorney had revealed the fabricated documents. You have 48 hours, Kevin. After that, the settlement offer expires. And we file a lawsuit for fraud and attempted theft of corporate assets. I really hope you make the smart choice here. The next 48 hours were among the worst of my life. My lawyer connected me with a forensic IT expert who specialized in digital evidence authentication, and we spent 12 hours going through every document David's team had provided. The corporate filing for Brennan Analytics LLC was real. Someone had actually filed paperwork with the state using my name and a fake address 6 weeks ago. The text messages appeared authentic, but the phone number associated with them wasn't mine, and the content referenced people and meetings I'd never been part of. The emails came from an account that looked like mine, but had a subtle difference in the domain, brennanconsulting.com instead of brennan.consulting.com, the kind of detail that would fool casual inspection, but fall apart under scrutiny. Quote 57. The IT expert told me, his fingers flying across his keyboard. Quote 58, and he looked up from his screen. Quote 59. I called Raymond Foster Monday morning. He answered on the third ring, his voice cheerful until he heard the tension in mine. I explained the situation in broad strokes, the dissolution, David's accusations, the fabricated evidence. Raymond, I need to ask you something directly. When we had lunch 2 weeks ago, did I say anything that could be interpreted as soliciting your business for a new firm? The line was quiet for a moment. You vented about your partner problems, he said carefully. You mentioned you were frustrated and considering your options. I asked if you were thinking about starting your own firm, and you said maybe, but that you hadn't decided anything yet. It was a hypothetical conversation between friends, not a business solicitation. Why? I told him about David's attorneys claiming the lunch was evidence of premeditated client theft. Raymond was quiet again, longer this time, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its casual warmth. I felt my blood turn cold. Raymond confirmed. Quote 67. I closed my eyes and saw the pattern emerge with terrible clarity. David hadn't just fabricated evidence to defend against my dissolution filing. He'd planned the entire scenario in advance, had created the narrative of me leaving before I'd even made the decision, had positioned himself to swoop in and secure client relationships while framing me as the one stealing business. The corporate filing 6 weeks ago, the conversations with clients 3 weeks ago, the carefully prepared evidence. It was all part of a strategy he'd been executing while I was still trying to save our partnership. Quote 68. Raymond agreed immediately, said he'd have his assistant pull phone records and draft a detailed account. I thanked him and hung up, then called my lawyer with the new information. She listened quietly as I explained David's preemptive call to clients, his narrative about me leaving before I'd decided to leave. This is good, she said, strategic gears turning in her voice. If we can show that David was planning to push you out and was creating justification for it before you filed for dissolution, that changes the entire narrative from you being a bad faith actor to you being a victim of systematic manipulation. We spent the next 12 hours assembling a counter-narrative. I had my documented warnings to David, witness statements from employees, now Raymond's testimony about the preemptive client call, and the IT expert's analysis showing the fabricated evidence had been created using stolen identity information. My lawyer drafted a comprehensive response that didn't just reject David's terms, but accused him of fraud, identity theft, and attempted theft of business opportunities. We filed it 10 hours before his 48-hour deadline expired. I expected anger, expected legal threats and escalation. What I didn't expect was his attorney calling my lawyer at 6 a.m. the next morning, asking for an emergency meeting with just the two principals, no attorneys present, completely off the record. Quote 71. My lawyer said when she relayed the request. Quote 72. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds before saying yes, because I needed to look David in the eye and understand who he'd become. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop neither of us frequented. I arrived first and took a table in the back corner, ordered black coffee I didn't drink, and watched David walk in 15 minutes late looking worse than I'd ever seen him. He'd lost weight, his suit hung wrong on his frame, and his eyes had a haunted quality. He sat down across from me without ordering anything, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, David broke the silence, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. Quote 73, he said, and I almost laughed at starting with that particular lie. Quote 74. I stared at him, trying to parse whether this was another layer of manipulation or something like genuine confession. Quote 75. I said slowly. Quote 76. David's hands were shaking slightly as he wrapped them around an imaginary coffee cup, and I noticed his wedding ring was missing. Emily left me, he said. She said I'd turned into someone she didn't recognize, someone who cared more about winning than about doing the right thing. She's staying with her sister in California. He looked up at me, and I saw genuine pain in his expression. I've been making unilateral decisions for months because I was terrified that if we kept operating as equal partners, we'd never grow fast enough to matter. I saw opportunities slipping away while we debated, and I convinced myself that acting decisively was leadership rather than betrayal. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but I crushed it down. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Your attorneys said 48 hours or you'd file for fraud charges. We filed our response showing your evidence was fabricated. So what's this meeting really about, David? He was quiet for another long moment, emotions playing across his face. The attorney who sent me that anonymous evidence package also sent me something else yesterday, he finally said. A bill for services rendered. Specifically, for creating a comprehensive identity theft package and fabricated business documents designed to support a narrative of my choosing. The coffee shop noise faded as I processed what he'd just said. Quote, 84. I said slowly. Quote, 85. Quote, 86. David said. Quote, 87. I should have felt satisfaction, but instead I just felt tired and sad and still angry. Quote, I asked. Quote, 89. David pulled out his phone and showed me the invoice. The Shell Corporation was registered in the Cayman Islands. The invoice referenced services dating back 3 months, and the amount, $250,000, suggested whoever was behind this had resources and long-term planning. I said. Quote, 91. I stopped as another possibility occurred to me. Quote, 92. David was shaking his head. Quote, 93. He trailed off, and I saw recognition dawn in his expression at the same time it clicked for me. Quote, 94, we said in unison. Sterling was our biggest competitor. A larger firm with more resources, but a reputation for aggressive business practices that bordered on unethical. I said, remembering the conversation with perfect clarity. Quote, 96. David had gone pale. Quote, 97. The pieces were falling into place with awful elegance. Sterling had manufactured our conflict, or at least exploited and accelerated existing tensions, by creating evidence that would make us destroy each other while they waited to scoop up the remains. The fabricated documents had been designed to make David act aggressively, to push us into litigation that would consume our resources and destroy our partnership beyond repair. Once we'd burned through our assets fighting each other, Sterling could sweep in and hire our best talent, acquire our intellectual property for pennies, and eliminate their primary competitor. We need proof, I said. We need to trace that invoice back to Sterling and prove they orchestrated this entire situation. David pulled out his phone again and scrolled through emails. Look at this, he said. The email was from Lawrence Hawthorne's executive assistant, scheduling a lunch meeting to quote 101 quote. The meeting had happened 2 days before David signed the Meridian contract. Quote 102, I asked. David's expression was miserable. He spent an hour telling me that you were holding the company back, that your cautious approach was causing us to miss opportunities. He specifically mentioned the Meridian deal, said he'd heard they were offering us terms, and that I should jump on it before they went to Sterling instead. He made it sound like urgent competitive intelligence. I felt another piece click into place. Sterling had known about the Meridian contract, had pushed David to sign it alone, knowing it would trigger my dissolution threat. They'd then provided David with fabricated evidence, ensuring that when the truth came out, he'd be the one who looked like the fraud. Either way, we both ended up destroyed, while Sterling remained positioned to pick up the pieces. The next week was a blur of investigation that revealed the full scope of Sterling's manipulation. Raymond confirmed that Sterling had approached him 2 weeks before my lunch with him, asking if he was satisfied with Harrison Analytics services. 3 other major clients reported similar conversations, all timed to periods when David and I had public disagreements. Our IT expert traced the invoice to a consulting firm that had done work for Sterling, though the connection was hidden behind shell corporations. Most damning, we found emails from Sterling's CEO to his executive team discussing, quote, 104, quote, and allocating resources to, quote, 105, quote. One email specifically mentioned, quote, 106, quote. David and I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the evidence we'd assembled, and I felt something shift between us that wasn't quite forgiveness, but was close to understanding. We have enough to file criminal fraud charges against Sterling, my lawyer said. Identity theft, corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud. We also have grounds for a massive civil suit for tortious interference and probably punitive damages. She looked up at us both. But pursuing this means putting Harrison Analytics in public spotlight for months, means admitting you were both manipulated. Your employees will be in limbo longer, your clients will lose confidence, and you'll spend the next year being lawyers' pawns instead of building anything new. I looked at David, and I saw him looking back at me with conflict mirroring my own. There's another option, David said slowly. We could let Sterling know that we have this evidence and that we're willing to trade it for something we need. We could use their guilt as leverage to rebuild, rather than just to punish. My lawyer looked skeptical, but I felt a spark of interest. What did you have in mind? David pulled out a piece of paper covered in his handwriting, notes and calculations, and what looked like a preliminary business plan. Sterling wanted to destroy us so they could acquire our assets cheaply. What if instead we sell them what they want at a premium price? Use the money to pay off our employees with severance packages that buy out their non-competes, and then we both start fresh. They get the Harrison Analytics brand and client list, we get enough capital to start new ventures, and our employees get taken care of. The logic was sound, but it meant swallowing my anger and my desire for public vindication, meant letting Sterling win even though we'd be making them pay for their victory. I thought about the 18 employees who'd committed to following me, thought about the other 25 who were caught in uncertainty. I want specific terms, I said finally. I want enough money to give every employee a full year's severance, enough to buy out all non-competes, enough left over to capitalize 2 new firms. I want Sterling to sign an agreement never to hire or approach any of our current employees, and I want them to admit in writing that they engaged in corporate espionage, even if that admission stays sealed. Most importantly, I want you to never make another unilateral decision about anything that affects me. We do this together, or we don't do it at all. David nodded without hesitation. Together, he agreed. Every decision, every term, every clause. Equal partners until the end. We spent the next 2 weeks negotiating with Sterling through intermediaries, using the evidence of their manipulation as leverage. Their initial offer was $3 million for all assets with no admission of wrongdoing. We countered with $15 million full employee severance packages, the written admission to be held in escrow, and a 5-year non-compete preventing Sterling from hiring any current employees. They came back at $7 million with partial severance. We held firm, and I watched David show the kind of negotiating skill I'd forgotten he possessed when we were working together. The final settlement was $12 million, full employee severance packages with non-compete buyouts, and a sealed document admitting Sterling's role that could be released if they violated any terms. David and I split the proceeds equally after employee payments, which gave us each about $3.5 million to capitalize new ventures. It was more than enough to start fresh, to build something without the weight of our shared history. The dissolution of Harrison Analytics happened quietly after that, with a press release about mutual decision to pursue separate opportunities and gratitude for the support of clients and employees. Sterling absorbed our client relationships, hired most of our remaining staff, and got what they wanted, even if they'd paid more for it than they'd hoped. On the last day of Harrison Analytics' official existence, David and I met one final time in the conference room with the mahogany table we'd bought together 6 years ago. The office was mostly empty, boxes stacked along walls, employee photographs removed. We'd signed all the final paperwork earlier that morning. Now it was just the 2 of us in the space where we'd had so many meetings, so many arguments, so many late-night strategy sessions when we'd believed we were building something that would last. David pushed a small box across the table toward me, and I opened it to find the first dollar we'd ever earned as a company, framed and mounted. I'd forgotten about it, forgotten that we'd been silly enough to frame our first client payment as a symbol of what we were becoming. "I thought you should have this," David said quietly. "You were always the one who cared about the symbolic stuff, the meaning behind what we were doing rather than just the numbers. I got too focused on winning and lost track of why we were playing in the first place." I looked at the framed dollar bill, remembered the day we'd gotten that first payment from a local restaurant, remembered how we'd celebrated with cheap champagne and takeout while sitting on my apartment floor because we didn't have office furniture yet. Quote, 120, I said. Quote, 123. David nodded, and I saw him blinking back tears that matched the ones I was trying to keep from falling. Quote, 124, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Quote, 125. It was the apology I'd needed months ago, and hearing it now felt both too late and exactly right. "I'm sorry too," I said, because I'd made my own mistakes in how I'd handled our conflicts, had let my resentment build instead of confronting problems directly. We both could have done better. At least we're ending this with some grace. We shook hands formally, and then David picked up his last box of personal items and walked out for the final time. I stayed in the conference room for another hour, just sitting at that table and thinking about everything we'd built and lost and learned. 6 months later, I stood in a new office with different furniture and a completely different energy, watching my team of 23 people work on analytics projects for clients who'd chosen to work with Brennan Consulting based on reputation and relationships. David had started his own firm across town, and we were friendly competitors who occasionally met for coffee and shared industry intelligence without the weight of partnership obligations or betrayal hanging between us. Sterling Data Solutions had suffered a public scandal when one of their executives leaked information about project dissolution to the press, and their stock price had tanked while regulators investigated. Raymond Foster had followed me to my new firm along with 4 other major clients, and the business was growing steadily. My daughter's school play was coming up again. This time she was playing a lead role, and I had the date marked in my calendar with 3 reminders. The framed dollar bill hung on my office wall now, a reminder of both what I'd built before and what I was building now, of partnerships that succeeded and partnerships that failed, of the complicated truth that sometimes the best outcome is learning when to let go and start fresh. I'd learned that success wasn't about winning fights or proving you were right, but about building something sustainable on foundations of genuine trust and mutual respect. Harrison Analytics was gone, but what David and I had learned together lived on in separate ventures that were healthier for the distance between them. On my desk sat a new photo of Maya from her last school play, beaming in her tree costume with her arms raised like branches, and every time I looked at it I was reminded why I'd fought so hard to rebuild on my own terms rather than accepting anyone else's version of what success should look like. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.